there comes a moment, a rare, almost seismic shift, when someone with an avoidant attachment style realizes they were wrong. It doesn't happen easily. Avoidance build lives on independence, control, and emotional distance. They're not wired to dive into vulnerability, but every now and then, something cracks their armor. Maybe it's the silence after someone finally walks away. Maybe it's the reflection that comes after yet another failed connection. Or maybe it's meeting someone who shows them love doesn't mean suffocation. It means partnership. And when that realization hits, it's not quiet, it's loud, it's messy, it's real. They look back and suddenly see all the missed opportunities for closeness, all the times they pushed someone away just when they needed to pull them in. They remember the walls they built out of fear, but disguised as strength. Now here's the twist. Realizing you're wrong doesn't automatically mean you're ready to do the work. The ego doesn't like being told it protected you at the cost of real intimacy. So the first instinct is shame. But that shame, that's the birthplace of growth. You see, when an avoidant finally says, "I was wrong," it's not just an apology, it's a transformation. It's a rebellion against their old story. And if they lean into that discomfort instead of retreating from it, something beautiful can emerge: accountability, emotional intimacy, and maybe for the first time, a relationship not built on fear, but on courage. Because the truth is, healing doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means becoming more of who you really are, beneath the fear, beneath the walls, beneath the coping. And if you're the person who's been hurt by the avoidant, know this: their realization doesn't make your pain disappear. You're not obligated to go back, but you are allowed to feel validated. You were never too much. They were too scared. Sometimes the most powerful moment in any relationship isn't when someone says, "I love you." It's when they say, "I see you and I'm sorry I couldn't before." Avoidants often mistake emotional distance for strength. It's a deeply ingrained belief that being self-reliant, guarded, and emotionally reserved equates to being powerful. From a young age, many avoidantly attached individuals learned that vulnerability was either punished, ignored, or unsafe. So they adapted. They became experts at self-soothing, minimizing their needs, and pulling away when emotions ran high. This detachment becomes their armor, their method of control in a world that once made them feel powerless. The problem is, this armor doesn't just keep pain out, it also keeps love out. To an avoidant, needing someone can feel like weakness, wanting connection, dangerous. They fear that closeness might lead to rejection or enmeshment, so they retreat, convince themselves they're fine alone, and intellectualize their emotions instead of feeling them. They often pride themselves on being rational or independent, unaware that much of that independence is actually fear wearing a mask. And so emotional distance becomes their default, not just with romantic partners, but often with friends, family, and even themselves. Intimacy feels like a risk, a transaction where they're always one emotional step behind just in case they need to run. When they're in relationships, avoidants tend to withdraw the moment things get intense. They may say all the right things, but their actions signal avoidance. Cancelled plans, vague communication, reluctance to define the relationship, or sudden coldness after moments of connection. They may genuinely care, but their instinct to protect themselves overrides their ability to show up consistently. They rationalize this behavior as strength. "I don't get attached easily. I don't need anyone. I'm just busy." When really, these are defense mechanisms dressed as boundaries. The irony is that true strength isn't about how well you can isolate yourself. It's about how bravely you can connect, even when it's uncomfortable. But for the avoidant, that kind of strength isn't intuitive. It's terrifying. They mistake self-protection for emotional mastery and confuse control with security. They believe that by staying distant, they're holding the high ground, not realizing that the very love and safety they crave are impossible to access from behind the walls they've built. Over time, this emotional distance creates patterns. Patterns where they sabotage closeness, choose unavailable partners, or criticize intimacy in others. And when relationships fail, they often tell themselves it's because they haven't found the right person, when in reality, it's that they haven't allowed anyone close enough to matter. They're stuck in a cyclic, craving connection, fearing it, rejecting it, then mourning its absence. And still, from the outside, they may appear calm, cool, unbothered. But beneath that calm is often a deep, unspoken loneliness, a part of them that why love always feels out of reach, why people leave, or why they never feel fully known. They may not show it, but the cost of emotional distance is steep. What feels like strength is often a quiet kind of suffering, masked by independence and driven by fear they haven't yet named. The realization that they were wrong doesn't usually come to avoidant individuals through a direct confrontation. In fact, they're often skilled at deflecting conflict, rationalizing their behavior, and minimizing emotional feedback from others. They may shut down, change the subject, or disappear when tension arises. So when someone calls them out or expresses hurt, the avoidant mind doesn't immediately absorb that feedback. It's often seen as pressure, drama, or emotional volatility, something to escape rather than reflect on. As a result, the moment of realization rarely happens in real time. It happens later, often in silence, in solitude, and after the connection they took for granted begins to fade, or is gone entirely. It might start with an unanswered message that never gets a reply, a phone call that isn't returned, a partner who once tried to reach them finally stops trying. At first they might feel relief. The pressure is gone. There's no longer someone asking for more than they feel comfortable giving. But slowly that silence grows louder. It begins to echo. The absence they once saw as freedom becomes something else entirely. Loneliness or an uneasy sense that something meaningful has slipped through their fingers. Reflection hits hardest in still moments. After the rush of work, the distractions, the surface level interactions, they begin to notice the void. And with that void comes clarity. They remember the partner who asked to be seen, the friend deeper connection, or the person who patiently waited for them to open up. They begin to recognize not just the other person's needs, but their own resistance to meeting them. Patterns that once seemed justified, canceling plans, withholding affection, keeping emotional distance, start to feel like missed opportunities, like self-sabotage dressed up as self-preservation. And it's not just about one person. It's about a lifetime of unacknowledged fears. The realization doesn't come like a single bolt of lightning. It's more like a slow unraveling, a growing awareness that the stories they've told themselves about needing space, about not being ready, about people being too needy, may have all been ways to avoid the risk of truly being seen. Avoidants often pride themselves on logic, but this kind of self-confrontation isn't logical. It's emotional. It stirs discomfort because it challenges the very identity they've built around independence. There's a particular pain in realizing the other person was right about them, that someone saw their avoidance for what it was and tried to help or understand. It's painful because it shows they were loved even when they were hard to love, and they couldn't receive it. That kind of love feels both beautiful and tragic in hindsight. When avoidants finally recognize they were wrong, it doesn't just shift their view of the relationship. It shakes the foundation of how they've approached closeness their whole life. And while the realization may not lead to immediate change, it creates a pause, a gap in their armor, a space where growth could begin if they're willing to sit with what that silence is really saying. Acknowledging fault is one of the most difficult things for an avoidant person to do, not because they lack intelligence or empathy, but because it challenges the identity they've spent years building. When an avoidant person admits they were wrong, they aren't just confessing to a mistake in behavior, they're confronting a deeper, more uncomfortable truth about themselves. For someone who has built their emotional world around safety, self-reliance, and control, this act of admission can feel like stepping into quicksand. The moment they say, I messed up, they're risking exposure. They're peeling back the layers they've used to protect themselves and admitting, if only quietly, that they didn't handle something well, not because they weren't capable, because they were afraid. That fear often hides behind polished excuses and logical justifications. The avoidant might say, I needed space, or I didn't want to escalate things, or it wasn't the right time. When in truth, they were overwhelmed by emotion and didn't know how to engage without feeling vulnerable. Owning up to that truth creates a collision between the person they want to believe they are, calm, rational, unaffected, and the reality of how their actions have affected someone else. This inner conflict generates shame, and shame is not an emotion the avoidant knows how to process easily. Unlike guilt, which says, I did something wrong. Shame says, there's something wrong with me. That internal narrative can spiral quickly. Instead of seeing their mistake as part of being human, they internalize it as a personal failure. The mind of the avoidant is wired to avoid that kind of pain, so their natural instinct is to distance themselves even further. From the other person, from the feelings, even from the memory of the situation. But if they allow themselves to sit in that discomfort, something begins to shift. They start to see that the wall they've leaned on for safety is the same wall that's kept them disconnected. What makes this stage so delicate is that it's easy to get stuck. An avoidant might intellectually understand they were wrong, but emotionally shut down before they can do anything about it. Or they may swing the other way, becoming overly critical of themselves, thinking they're incapable of change or unworthy of forgiveness. Both responses are forms of avoidance. One masks the discomfort with detachment, and the other masks it with self-punishment. Neither invites growth. True progress begins when the avoidant chooses to stay present with the discomfort, not to run from it, but to listen to it. That discomfort is actually trying to teach them something important, that admitting fault doesn't make them weak, and feeling regret doesn't mean they're broken. It means they care. It means they're human. The pain they feel in recognizing their mistake is a sign of emotional awakening, not failure. It's the beginning of emotional accountability, something that cannot exist in the absence of vulnerability. The path forward requires courage, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, persistent kind. The kind of courage it takes to look someone in the eye and say, I hurt you. I didn't show up when it mattered, and I see that now. It's a small sentence, but for someone avoidant, it can be a monumental breakthrough. And that breakthrough doesn't erase the past, but it creates space for a more honest future. True change in someone with an avoidant attachment style begins the moment they choose vulnerability over ego. That decision is not sudden or easy. It's a conscious act of emotional bravery that goes everything their internal wiring tells them is safe. For avoidance, ego often serves as a defense system. It's not about arrogance, it's about self-protection. The ego convinces them they're better off alone, that needing someone is weak, and that emotional closeness is dangerous. It whispers narratives like, you don't need anyone, or they'll just leave anyway, building a fortress around their heart. But vulnerability threatens that fortress. It invites in the possibility of being hurt, misunderstood, or rejected. And for the avoidant, those possibilities feel like threats to their very sense of self. Yet, in moments of realization, especially after losing someone meaningful or confronting repeated relationship patterns, they begin to sense that something has to shift. They start to recognize that emotional distance hasn't protected them as much as it has isolated them. That keeping people at arm's length hasn't spared them pain, it's just delivered it in quieter, lonelier forms. And in that space, if they're open, they might experiment with something unfamiliar honesty. Vulnerability in this context doesn't mean oversharing or emotional dependence. It means allowing someone to see who they really are underneath the strategies, the fear, the hesitation, the desire for love they've tried to suppress. Choosing vulnerability is a radical act for the avoidant. It might look like reaching out first instead of waiting in silence. It might be admitting that they were scared instead of pretending they didn't care. It might even be something as simple as sitting one during an uncomfortable conversation without shutting down or walking away. These moments may seem small on the outside, but internally, they're battles between the old self and the emerging self. Letting go of ego means accepting that they don't always have to be in control. That emotions can be messy, unpredictable, and still worth feeling. It means allowing themselves to be seen not as perfect or put together, but as a human being who sometimes struggles, sometimes withdraws, and is now trying to choose a new way of being. Vulnerability forces them to relinquish the illusion of superiority or detachment and instead connect on a level that is raw, equal, and real. And that connection, the one formed in truth rather than performance, is where real intimacy begins. Not the fantasy of closeness they've mentally rehearsed, but the kind built through shared discomfort, accountability, and presence. Vulnerability is not about exposure without safety. It's about choosing to be emotionally honest even when it feels unfamiliar or risky. For the avoidant, it's an invitation to stop performing strength and start embodying it. By showing up, by opening up, and by finally allowing else to meet them in the space where fear used to live. When an avoidant finally reaches the point of realizing they were wrong, the apology that follows, if they find the courage to express it, is rarely just for the person they hurt. At its core, it becomes an apology to themselves. It's an acknowledgement of the internal conflict they've carried for years, a reckoning with all the ways they've denied their own emotional needs in the name of safety and control. For so long, they've lived behind barriers not only to keep others out, but to protect a version of themselves they thought was unlovable or too vulnerable to be seen. Reply: realizing they were wrong means recognizing that those walls didn't serve them the way they believed they did. This kind of realization brings with it a deep sadness, not only for what was lost in the relationship, but for what they've been denying themselves all along. Avoidants often suppress their own longing for connection. They convince themselves they're fine without affection, without closeness, without being deeply understood. But once the emotional armor starts to crack, they begin to feel just how much they've missed. The apology becomes less about smoothing things over and more about grieving the parts of themselves they've kept hidden. It's a moment of emotional honesty where they finally admit that they wanted to be loved. They just didn't know how to let it in. In that moment, they may start to see their past behavior through a clearer lens. The distance, the detachment, the shutting down during crucial conversations. All of it becomes harder to justify when they understand the consequences of those actions. They begin to see how much they've not only others, but themselves. Every time they turned away from love out of fear, they denied themselves the experience of real intimacy. Every time they withheld affection, they reinforced the story that they were safer alone. And now, with that awareness, the apology holds a different weight. It's not performative. It's not about saving face or getting someone back. It's about owning up to the ways they've self-sabotaged and acknowledging that those behaviors came from fear, not malice. In a way, they're speaking to the version of themselves that was too afraid to trust, too afraid to open up, and saying, I see you. I understand why you did what you did, but you deserved more. That self-compassion is critical. Without it, they risk falling into shame and retreating even further into avoidance. But with it, there's potential for healing, because real change starts with empathy, not just for others, but for oneself. This shift creates space for growth. The avoidant can begin to rewrite their internal narrative, no longer as someone who must remain guarded to survive, but as someone who is capable of love, worthy of closeness, and strong enough to risk being seen. The apology then becomes a doorway, not just back to the relationship they may have damaged, but to a more honest relationship with themselves. Healing doesn't begin when one person apologizes or when the relationship is magically fixed. It begins when both sides face the truth of what actually happened, without excuses, without rewriting the past, and without minimizing each other's experience. In the dynamic between an avoidant and their partner, the damage is rarely one-sided, but the emotional imbalance often stems from avoidance being mistaken for indifference and vulnerability being misread as neediness. The partner of an avoidant may have spent months, even years, trying to be seen, constantly questioning their worth in the face of emotional unavailability. And the avoidant, wrapped in their internal defenses, may have genuinely believed they were protecting both parties by pulling away. But once the truth surfaces, that the behavior was rooted in fear, not strength or superiority, it shifts the entire story. That moment of shared recognition is powerful. The person who was hurt gets to feel seen, not as someone who was too much, but as someone who simply asked for connection and didn't receive it. That validation matters deeply. Often, those on the receiving end of avoidance carry a heavy emotional burden. They internalize the rejection, thinking they were the problem, when in reality, they were responding normally to abnormal levels of emotional withdrawal. When the avoidant finally owns their part, it can restore a sense of sanity to the person who was dismissed or misunderstood. It allows them to exhale and realize it wasn't all in their head. Their feelings were real, and they were asking for something reasonable: presence, intimacy, and emotional security. For the avoidant, this truth can be hard to face. It requires looking back at the moments they shut down, the opportunities they missed, and the people they pushed away, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to stay. But when they acknowledge this, not defensively, but openly, something shifts. That act breaks the cycle of avoidance. Instead of running from the discomfort, they face it. And in doing so, they create a rare moment of emotional safety, not just for the other person, but for themselves. Healing becomes possible in that space because both people stop fighting the wrong battles. The partner no longer has to prove their worth, and the avoidant no longer has to pretend they don't care. Instead, they meet in the rawness of reality. And while that doesn't guarantee reconciliation or continuation of the relationship, it does offer closure. It gives both people the dignity of truth. Sometimes, the most intimate you can do with someone isn't to fix everything, but to finally see and hear them without distortion. Avoidance thrives in silence and misunderstanding, but healing thrives in clarity. When both parties can name what really happened, not in anger, but in awareness, it creates the potential for growth. Maybe they grow together, or maybe they part ways, but with a sense of mutual understanding. Because the truth, when faced honestly, becomes the foundation for something more real than anything the old patterns ever offered. So, what truly happens when the avoidant realizes they were wrong? It's not just an apology. It's not just a confession. It's an awakening, a quiet but profound shift from self-protection to self-awareness, from hiding behind independence to standing in emotional truth. It's a breaking of the cycle, where avoidance is no longer seen as strength and vulnerability is no longer feared as weakness. It's the moment the avoidant sees the hurt they've caused, not from a place of shame, but from a place of responsibility. The moment they recognize that intimacy is not the enemy, it's the very thing they've always craved, but didn't know how to receive. And in that realization, they are finally offered a choice: continue the old pattern of distance and disconnect, or begin the brave, uncomfortable, deeply human process of showing up, not perfectly, not instantly. But honestly, this change doesn't guarantee a fairy tale ending. Healing isn't linear, and reconnection, whether with someone else or with themselves, takes time, patience, and a willingness to face what they once avoided. But that first crack in the wall, that first moment of accountability, that's everything. Because from that place, something real can finally grow. To those who have loved someone with an avoidant heart, your voice matters, your pain is valid. And to the avoidance on the path of growth, you're not broken, you're becoming. Thank you for being here, for listening with openness, and for reflecting with honesty. Whether you're healing, helping someone heal, or simply learning more about the human heart, your presence in these conversations matters. Take care of yourself, keep showing up, and as always, thank you for your time. Until next time.